Good evening, folks. I'm Larson Halleck, your certified personal trainer and semi-certified anthropologist, and it's time once again for some Manthropology. This time around, we'll be going to a rich and exotic culture, to the beautiful islands of the South Seas. That's right, we're revisiting and going far more in-depth into the theories of one Margaret Mead, and of course we'll be discussing how they were wrong and how people just keep believing them anyway. And of course, we'll also discuss how Mead's true believers are making our lives just a little bit worse. Let's flash back to 1925. World War I is in recent memory. Germany has lost its territory in Samoa, and Eastern Samoa still remains under American control, and to this day it is known as American Samoa. Various Western influences had existed in Polynesia for centuries, in particular missionary activity, and it is in this spirit that young Margaret Mead comes to American Samoa, seeking to do research for her doctoral thesis in anthropology, a doctorate that was done under the tutelage of the one and only Franz Boas. As I've discussed previously, this was the first inkling of the new anthropology, which did good in challenging the blatantly colonialist and eugenic ethnography of the time.
That's good.
But in doing so, created a precedent of everybody is exactly the same.
That's bad.
So to discuss this whole issue, we should of course start with what Ms. Mead wrote, interspersed with how it was right or wrong. I specify right or wrong because I'm not afraid to admit that some of what she says is not only accurate, but it aligns with some of what we say in the reactosphere. But then almost immediately after saying something like that, she will spill forth some pause that can be directly linked to what makes the world suck today, and then deliver some more pause. But hey, what do you expect from a 23-year-old college girl who even her fans admit was a sexually progressive lass who set out with a political agenda in her research? It's honestly a bit frustrating how she comes very close to making a legitimate anthropological inquiry, but then ruins it with the idealism that she wears on her sleeve. And if you don't believe me, take a look at the foreword, written by FB himself. Courtesy and good manners are universal, but what constitutes those things are radically different in each culture. That's absolutely true. He then claims that much of the fundamental human traits are in fact social constructs. Thus, Ms. Mead does us a great service by shining a light on other cultures so we can understand that these human traits are in fact not human at all, but vary by culture. We're gonna see about that, buddy. Mr. Boas is very much a man of nurture rather than nature. The results of her investigation confirm that what we attribute to human nature is in fact a reaction to the constraints of a civilization. Anyway, Mead makes it pretty clear that she wants to change the world, primarily, and maybe kinda secondarily form an accurate anthropology. Her fans are probably up in arms already, so I guess I should apologize. I mean, I can't imagine where I would get the idea that this is an ideological tract first, except for, I don't know, the cover of the book. A psychological study of primitive youth for Western civilization. She did fluently learn the language and live amongst her subjects to her immense credit, and that's more than we could say for many anthropologists of the time, and even anthropologists now. Shortly thereafter, however, Mead says that she concentrated on the girls of Samoa because of her own sex and because of a paucity of information on that topic. Don't get me wrong, it's okay to focus on one facet of a culture, except that she infers much based on this limited worldview. She kind of admits to this. I spent more time playing with children than in the councils of the elders. In fact, she was barred from chiefly consortiums specifically because she was a woman, which kind of debunks some of her conclusions, but we'll get to that. The noble savage hagiography, that thing which I'm repeatedly told by angry cultural anthropologists isn't a thing, is pretty evident as early as Chapter 2's A Day in the Life of Samoa. The night is populous with ghosts, and as day breaks, they shout lustily to each other as they hasten in their work. The women are half-clad and unhurried, and later on in the day there is soft and barbaric singing of Christian hymns. And as the chapters go on, and she discusses the various aspects of Samoan society and child rearing, we see that there's a few more things right and a whole lot wrong. As illustrated with these two contrasting quotes, she mentions, on the one hand, that a girl's chances of marriage are slim if she is believed to be lazy and inept in domestic tasks. That's something Samoa has in common with most other places, or at least it did. But then, on page 66, It is better to live as a girl with no responsibility and a rich variety of emotional experience. That is the best period of her life. Doesn't that just sound familiar? And then we get something like, the inferiority feeling as we know it is very rare in Samoa. The only two inferiority feelings I saw were clumsiness on the dance floor and clumsiness in sexual relations. Yeah, except for that, really complex and defined caste system. Let's skip further ahead, where she summarizes all she has seen and how it can be applied to the American pedagogy. Namely, she asks, is adolescence inevitably a period of mental and emotional stress for the girl? Following the Samoan girl, we can answer that question in the negative. Look how the Samoan girl defers marriage with as many years of casual sex as possible. Citations are needed for the Samoan casual sex thing, but as luck would have it, we do have a few case studies of American women deferring marriage with as many years of casual sex and frivolity as possible. We must say, quite simply, that there must be some difference in the two civilizations that accounts for the difference in results. Undoubtedly, different cultures produce different lifeways and peoples, and unlike your average leftist, I appreciate the uniqueness of all cultures and peoples. Quoth Mead, there are two important components that cause the differences. One component is inherently Samoan, and one is generally attributed to primitive societies. The thing that makes coming of age in Samoa such a simple process is the casualness of the whole society. Samoa is a place where nobody plays for high stakes. Nobody pays a heavy price. No one suffers for his convictions or fights to the death for some end. Yeah, except for spousal abuse and blood feud and honor killings, and overall a very highly masculine honor culture. And yeah, I know some of these are from New Guinea and other Polynesian cultures that are similar to but distinct from Samoa, but more on those in a bit. There are no implacable gods, angry and punishing, to disturb the tenor of the days. Ah yeah, there's no Polynesian deities related to war, except for, all of these that I found via 10 minutes of Wikipedia-ing, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce. Disagreements between a husband and his wife's seducer are settled by a few fine mats. No. In fact, cuckoldry is very frowned upon, as it is in every culture. There is some grain of truth to what she's saying, in that during their years of wayfinding, the Polynesians avoided the Malthusian conflict of small island life by moving out, rather than fighting. But that doesn't mean that they are the peaceful, matriarchal goddess worshippers Mead wants them to be. The gifted and precocious are held back until the slow have matched their level. So she's claiming they don't care about rank, which is kind of odd for a culture that has a caste system. Then, oddly enough, in the midst of all this progressive fal-de-rah, she says something that's almost reactionary. She describes how the abundance of choices and diversity in modern society might make things more difficult, whereas all primitive societies, not just Samoa, have one set of gods and behaviors and etc., which means they are psychologically more stable than Westerners. That much is actually true, and the positive effects of a monoculture and tribal cohesion have been well documented. The close relationship between parent and child that has such a defining influence in our civilization is not found in Samoa. It takes a village, just like Hillary Clinton says. We pay for our heterogeneous, rapidly changing civilization, delinquency, crime, and neuroses. And again, she's not wrong about that. Hopefully, we will have realized the high points of individual choice and universal tolerance that only a high heterogeneous culture can attain. Samoa knows its one way of life and teaches it to her children. Will we, with the knowledge of many ways, allow our children to choose? In other words, she seems to think that we can learn some things from Samoan culture, and I'm certainly not adverse to learning about and learning from other cultures, but as you've probably figured out, some of what she says has been proven to be less than accurate. First of all, as she herself admits, the majority of her time was spent interviewing little girls rather than, I don't know, the chiefs of the tribe who might know a bit more about what goes on. Well, then again, she couldn't interview them because, again, As a woman, she was not allowed into the chiefly consortiums. Ignoring the Freeman controversy, which claimed that her informants deliberately misled her for shits and giggles, and ignoring all the discrepancies I've already pointed out, we can point out even more objective inaccuracies. As many have pointed out, she lived with a Western missionary family in a Western household during her time in Samoa, and thus her research was likely not thorough. Steven Pinker points out that far from the sexually nonchalant utopia Mead portrays, Samoan men, perhaps in the 1920s, not so much nowadays, take virginity of their brides very seriously, and can become abusive if they find otherwise, and a cuckolded husband may very well engage in the old-fashioned eye-for-an-eye blood feud against the other man and his family. But I think what illustrates it best is the fact that when later anthropologists gave translations of Mead to Samoan men, particularly those passages where Mead discusses how Samoan society does not esteem masculine men and warriors, the men became quite enraged. Far from the happy and peaceful cuckolds Mead wrote about, Samoan men are in fact strong, prideful, and valiant fighting men. In other words, Vince McMahon has a stronger grasp on Samoan culture than Margaret Mead. Briefly, I would like to also touch upon some other Polynesian cultures that Margaret Mead wrote about. In her 1935 Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies, she traveled to Papua New Guinea to look at some tribes and, surprise, get perfunctory research to form around her theories. One, the Arapesh, were described as having both males and females being graceful, cooperative, and all things that Western society calls feminine. Another, the Mundugamor, described both males and females being belligerent, swaggering, and assertive, traditional masculine stereotypes. And the third, the Chambuli, being a complete inversion of Western gender roles. Men were described as being emotional and gossipy, and women were domineering, practical, and other things that we associate with masculinity. The conclusion that was reached was that traditional gender roles as we know them were socially constructed, and that there was no real practical basis to them at all. No more than the headdresses of chiefs signify masculinity or femininity. The problem with this was that the data was bullshit. Far from the gentle androgynes Mead wanted them to be, the Arapesh, in fact, had a long tradition of wife stealing and other intermittent tribal battles, somewhat suppressed at the time by German occupation, but it still occurred. The old men bragged of their heroism in battle, and men organized themselves into hierarchies of strength and accomplishment, as pretty much all men do in all cultures. Or we can cite the Arapesh proverb, men's hearts are different, women's hearts are different. Data on the other two tribes were not quite as falsified, but they were still misinterpreted. There had been economic depression in the area by the standards of these peoples, and the women were working similar labors to the men simply because all hands were needed. When observed at other times by other anthropologists, these two tribes were similarly patriarchal to the Arapesh, and indeed, women doing hard labor is certainly not unusual throughout world history. Whenever large numbers of people are needed to labor, as in non-mechanized agriculture, you will inevitably find women working alongside the men. Oh, and as a side note, there is still rampant domestic abuse and witch burnings that go on to this day in Papua New Guinea. So that was a brief discussion of how Margaret Mead's research and findings were wrong. Since this is such a weighty topic, the next edition of Manthropology will deal with the societal and cultural effects of the research that are still felt to this day. With all that I've said, I can't totally hate Margaret Mead. I mean, the 1920s were just starting to liberalize sexually and culturally, and undoubtedly she saw that as a good thing and wanted to aid it. I mean, she was naive and idealistic, as many college students are, and she couldn't have known that in 2017 her research would have the adverse effects that it has had. And most importantly, she was pretty much the only anthropologist of note who defended my boy Napoleon Chagnon when he was being keel-hauled by the establishment. And finally, there's this quote, which you've probably seen at some point. I absolutely agree with this. After all, I am waging a one-man crusade to reform the field of anthropology, aren't I? I'm Larson Halleck. I appreciate humanity in all of its splendor, and stay tuned for next week's video.